Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me okay with this mic here? I appreciate you all spending part of your Saturday morning with us. I see some familiar faces and some people I haven't met before, and then welcome you all. I'm also always curious whenever I do a talk, nobody ever sits in the front row seats. And I have an idea. Let's just get rid of the front row, and then we won't have to worry about that. In 1998, my first book, The Rock of Anzio, was published. Now, 20 years later, my second book about the Battle of Anzio has also been published. In fact, the ink on the pages are still wet because it just came out October 31st. Now, why did I find it necessary to write a second book on basically the same topic? And what could I find out that was different from what I wrote about in the first book? Well, first let's cover the big picture. What, when, and where was the Battle of Anzio? We'll start with a little geography. In September of 1943, American and British forces landed in the southern part of Italy. The Americans and some British units arrived here at Salerno from Sicily, and the rest of the British 8th Army arrived at Taranto, and they were all moving towards the northwest to obviously capture Rome and to defeat the Germans who had garrisoned the country. As they moved up, they had to go through the Apennine Mountains that form the rocky spine of Italy. Not surprisingly, the tough, battle-hardened Germans opposed them every step of the way. And as you can see, the terrain of central Italy is extremely mountainous, a lot like Colorado's high country. It's also intercut with numerous fast-flowing rivers. To compound the problem, the winter weather in Italy can be nasty, capable of slowing an advancing force to a halt while providing aid to the defenders. In addition to the weather and terrain, the Allied advance became totally stalled when it came up against a series of defensive lines, well-fortified lines that ran the entire width of country. The main line, shown in red here, that ran through Khe Sanh is called the Gustav Line. And it was anchored on top of Monte Cassino by the Benedictine monastery that was formed in about 800 AD. So it had been there for quite some time. The fighting along the Gustav Line was very brutal, as you might imagine, and the Germans were determined to hold on to every foot of real estate. Once the stalemate began in October, 5th Army Commander Mark Clark began to conceive of an end run around the western flank of the Gustav Line. Clark's boss, British Field Marshal Harold Alexander, liked the idea too and proposed it to Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who also became very enthusiastic about it. Everyone thought that such a landing behind German lines would so frighten the German commander, Albert Kesselring, that he would pull his troops out of the Gustav Line and hightail it for the Alps. That was the normal military solution to having enemy in your rear. The spot chosen for the landing were the twin coastal resort towns of Anzio and Nettuno, located just 40 miles south of Rome. Anzio had been a resort for centuries. In fact, the Emperor Nero even had a luxurious seaside villa at Anzio, which was called Antium in ancient times. The three Allied leaders were convinced that such a landing behind enemy lines had the possibility of putting Allied troops in Rome within a week or two. And that would turn the tide of the war in Italy. So the decision was made to launch the operation codenamed Shingle on January 22nd, 1944. The fact that there weren't enough landing craft or troops to adequately make a major assault inland didn't seem to bother anyone except Major General John Lucas, whose 6th Corps, made up of several U.S. and British divisions, was selected to make the invasion. Lucas recalled how his 6th Corps was almost thrown back into the sea 3 months earlier during the invasion at Salerno, and he was worried that the same thing was going to happen at Anzio. Inexplicably excluded from the planning and decision-making process, Lucas was pessimistic about the chances for Shingle's success. But like the professional soldier he was, he said, "Yes, sir," and proceeded to try and carry out his assignment. So in the early hours of January 22nd, 36,000 soldiers of the American 3rd and British 1st Infantry Division, along with a few hundred commandos and rangers and paratroopers, began splashing ashore at Anzio and Nettuno, expecting at any moment the Germans were going to open up on them. But except for some sporadic shell fire, there was no opposition. Total surprise had been achieved. The men came ashore, moved inland a few miles, and waited for the inevitable counterattack, which didn't come. On the far left flank of the invasion area, the British troops took up positions in deep, dry creek beds, kind of reminiscent of the trench warfare of World War I. Lucas has been forever blamed for not taking advantage of the complete surprise and for not being more forceful and setting his forces immediately on the road to Rome. But Clark had given him vague orders, cautioning him just before the invasion was launched to not be too aggressive. As far as the cautious Lucas was concerned, his main job then was to secure the beachhead and not do anything foolish that would risk his command. And he decided to wait for more supplies and reinforcements to arrive before he did anything in the way of heading towards Rome. The decision cost him the element of surprise, but in fact may have saved the 6th Corps from annihilation. A master of the defense, Khe Sanh, brought in forces the Allies didn't even know he had, and encircled the beachhead with hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces and thousands of combat-hardened men without needing to weaken or abandon the Gustav Line. Under General Eberhard von Mackensen, the 14th Army commander, the Germans launched one human wave attack after another at the Yanks and the Tommies, hoping to break the Allied line. Night and day, the Germans pummeled the closely packed beachhead with hundreds of artillery pieces, including 2 giant railcar-mounted guns dubbed Anzio Annie and the Anzio Express. The Luftwaffe, too, although outnumbered, ceaselessly bombed Allied positions, including the big, clearly marked hospitals that were well within range. In fact, there would be eventually 4 hospitals at Anzio, all packed into a very small area. Here you see the damage caused by one of the raids. Many patients, doctors, and nurses were killed in these attacks. The Luftwaffe also employed remote-controlled glide bombs, kind of forerunners to cruise missiles of today, to attack Allied ships in the Anzio harbor. The entrenched Allies met every German assault with an incredible expenditure of munitions, from mortars and artillery to machine guns and small arms fire, to hundreds of bombers, to the guns of warships lying off the coast. The Germans paid a heavy toll for their continued attacks, and no one can doubt the bravery of the German soldier. Meanwhile, 100 miles to the south, near Naples, Clark and Alexander had their headquarters in the opulent palace at Caserta, which is larger than the palace at Versailles. Here the generals and their staffs, far from the sounds of the guns, lived in luxury that boggles the mind, dining in splendor on meals prepared by the finest chefs from New York and London who were on their staffs, while the dining facilities for the ordinary troops in the field were a little less than luxurious. And the living accommodations, it could be said, left a little to be desired. Even the nurses at the hospital were required to dig foxholes for their own protection. Some soldiers, like these troops, used a bit of sardonic British wit to deal with the fact that they were, in fact, as one soldier put it, living like rats in the mud. Bill Malden, who served with the 45th Division, the Colorado and Oklahoma National Guard at Anzio, said, "Mud is a special curse that seems to save itself for wartime. I'm sure Europe never got this muddy in peacetime." Even General Lucas at Anzio had to have his headquarters deep underground in a wine cellar to stay safe from the relentless shelling. On the eastern flank of the beachhead, Major General Lucian Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division was tasked with the taking of the city of Cisterna, an objective that, despite constant attempts, would elude the Americans for 4 months. It was here that Darby's Ranger Force, leading the attack on Cisterna, was ambushed and destroyed. Only 6 men out of 700 who went into the attack returned. The rest were either killed or captured. Here you see some of the captured Rangers being paraded through Rome by the Germans. The small town of Aprilia, about 10 miles north of Anzio, and located on the main highway to Rome, 30 miles away, became another one of the focal points of the battle. Aprilia was sometimes called the factory because of the twin towers that looked like industrial smokestacks. Aprilia had been the brainchild of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, shown here. Here he is, during the dedication of the town in 1937, accompanied by Nazi Germany's Rudolf Hess, right next to him, and you could see Italian and Nazi flags in the windows of the building behind them. Aprilia was one of several agriculture-based towns ordered built by Mussolini to populate the former swampy Pontine marshes and turn the area into productive farmland. During some of the hardest fighting of the entire campaign, Aprilia changed hands several times, and the fighting at Anzio in its rubble-strewn streets at Aprilia was often hand-to-hand. Here's Aprilia before the battle and after. Pretty well destroyed. Here you can see German armor. I've pointed out a self-propelled gun here and a German half-track. There's an American Sherman tank here and another one over there in a little town called Caracito, or Caracito, and in the background you can see Aprilia. Obviously there was a heavy battle that took place in Caracito. Heavy fighting also took place at a feature called the overpass by the Americans and the flyover by the British. This was a crucial terrain feature because it was where the Germans had to break through if they were to have any hope of splitting the Allied line and driving the Allies back into the sea. This map shows the location of the overpass that spanned the highway and railroad line from Anzio to Rome. There's a closer view of the overpass after the battle and another shot. This is a painting, it's a little fuzzy, but this was done by one of the British troops that I interviewed, and this was his vision of what the battle at the flyover, as he called it, looked like. But here, as with everywhere along the Allied line, the British and Americans held firm, tearing the German ranks to pieces and leaving the battlefield strewn with hundreds of German corpses, as well as many Allied soldiers who made the ultimate sacrifice. In my May talk here, some of you were there for that, I spoke about the incredible courage of the 157th Colorado Infantry Regiment, which was in the center of much of the action during the Anzio fighting, and was forced to hold out in a series of caves while being attacked and relentlessly forced to fight for their lives in these caves. The intensity of the attacks could not be sustained indefinitely, so when at last the German assaults began to slacken in mid-February, General Lucas, tired and worn out, as well as a target for intense criticism from his superiors, was replaced as commander of 6th Corps by Lucien Truscott, the more aggressive and dynamic commander of the 3rd Infantry Division. But the Germans never gave up. For the next 3 months, 6th Corps absorbed every punishment the Germans could throw at them. Time and again, the Germans came at the British and Americans expecting to crack the line, but failing every time. And I'd like to read a little excerpt from the book. It's a start of, I think, chapter 3. T.S. Eliot once wrote, "April is the cruelest month," but at Anzio, February 1944 claimed that title. At no other time would the fighting be as hard, the casualties as heavy, the weather as miserable, and the stakes as high. As night closed in around the battlefield like a black shroud on February 1st, the American and British soldiers got ready, not for rest, but for renewed terrors. It was one thing to fight during daylight hours, when one could at least see the enemy, when the enemy had shape and form, and could be placed in the sights of one's gun. That was reality. But nighttime was an entirely different equation. Unless flares were burning overhead, hanging from their tiny parachutes, the battlefield at night was a horrorscape of shadows and sounds. That noise ahead, was that an enemy patrol closing in, or just a cow stumbling around in search of fodder? Was that whistle a night bird, or a coded message from one patrol to another? The rumble of engines, your tanks or theirs? Was that boom off in the distance merely thunder, or the start of another artillery barrage? The mind plays tricks on you on the battlefield at night, admitted Veer Williams, Company K, 157th Regiment from Snyder, Colorado, near Fort Morgan. Quote, the new replacements, they got scared real fast, and us old veterans had a hard time trying to calm them down. Them kids wanted to get up and get out of there at the slightest noise. They were as skitterish as rabbits, unquote. February also brought more massive artillery duels to the beachhead. The Americans and British marveled ruefully at the German gunners' ability to saturate their positions with high explosives, the long fingers of the artillery reaching out to blast every nook and cranny of the battlefield. We was packed in there real tight, recalled Williams. The Germans had the high ground, and they could practically look down our throats. It was like shooting sardines in a can. The Americans knew that a massive German counterattack was coming, but military intelligence could not tell the units precisely when that counterattack might occur. Just that with signs that the Germans were continuing to truck new units into the area, it was likely to happen very soon. All the Americans and British could do was improve their positions, stock up on food and ammunition, and wait. As the months wore on, Allied strength was increasing as the Allies prepared for the breakout from the beachhead. It would start down at Khe Sanh on the Gustav Line. On May 11th, the Allied troops there began their violent attempt to finally crack the German line, and this time, after 4 previous attempts, they were successful. And the abbey fell to a division of Polish troops who were part of the British 8th Army. Here's a look at the Polish War Memorial behind the abbey where hundreds of troops who stormed Monte Cassino are buried. On May 24th, it became the turn of Truscott's 6th Corps to finally break out of the battlefield and begin the rush to Rome. One captured German soldier said it was the most vicious thing he'd ever witnessed, even worse than the time he had spent on the Eastern Front. For a week, the fighting was intense and bloody, but the Allies were making slow and steady progress. The city of Cisterna, or what was left of it, finally fell to the 3rd Division. Here you see some of Cisterna's stunned defenders who were forced to surrender. Enemy soldiers by the thousands were rounded up and sent off to POW cages. Clark had one goal in mind, for his American 5th Army to take Rome without the help of any British troops, not even the British who were part of his 5th Army. Blasting their way through every obstacle that the retreating Germans could establish, the Yanks fought against rearguard elements who tried to delay the entrance of the Americans long enough for the rest of the German army in Italy to escape to the north and set up new defensive positions. On June 4th, 1944, Clark's 5th Army, Americans only, no Brits allowed, entered the Eternal City and claimed the spoils of victory. 2 days later, what happened? The Allied invasion of France was launched, and the victory in Italy became yesterday's news. 11 more months of bitter fighting would still take place in Italy, and all the hard work and sacrifice by the Allied troops there would take a back seat to the rapid advances across France, Belgium, Holland, and into Germany itself. The casualties incurred during the Battle of Anzio were heavy, as you can see from this chart. So that's the basic story about Anzio, but wait, there's more. My earlier book, The Rock of Anzio, is a story of the 45th Infantry Division, of which as I said, the 157th Colorado Infantry Regiment was a part. But there was much more I wanted to explore with this second book, like detailing the bond between British and American soldiers who fought side by side against the Germans. I also wanted to talk more about the ordeal of Aprilia, the small fascist village of 2,000 people that became the focus of much of the fighting in February 1944. The difficult plight of civilians caught up in a war is rarely written about, but I managed to find an account in Italian by Pasqualini Nuti, the son of Aprilia's police chief who had a harrowing escape from the town when the battle swept through it. So I've included an account of the battle as seen through the eyes of a 9-year-old child. Here's what the church and town square looked like after the battle. This is the bronze statue of St. Michael standing in front of St. Michael's Church, about the only thing left standing. And here's a more recent picture of the center of Aprilia and the church, which has come back to life as a major industrial center and now has a population of about 70,000. Here's that statue of St. Michael in front of the church. And a close-up of him still on his pedestal. I also wanted to do what I could to restore the reputation of General Lucas, who was responsible for leading 6th Corps ashore and who has been, in my view, unfairly blamed for all the things that went wrong, or at least all the things that did not go according to his superiors' expectations. I think that history has proved that by being cautious and not rushing to Rome, Lucas saved 6th Corps from destruction. I also wanted to expand upon a few aspects of the operation that have gotten short shrift in previous books about Anzio. Topics such as the contributions of black pilots, known as the Tuskegee Airmen, who helped defend the beachhead from the sky by engaging the German pilots who dared to attack the Allied forces at Anzio. I wanted to give credit to the Japanese Americans of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team who were in the thick of the fighting during the breakout in May. And Robert Frederick's combined U.S. and Canada 1st Special Service Force, known as the Devil's Brigade, who were capable of performing incredible feats, but were not used anywhere near their capabilities. And Colonel Bill Darby, the father of the American Rangers, whose force was ambushed and all but wiped out during the assault on Cisterna. I wanted to tell the story of how a British lieutenant, Eric Fletcher Waters, the father of Pink Floyd's founder, Roger Waters, died, and how his death inspired Roger to create the album and movie The Wall, and the song When the Tigers Broke Free. How many have ever seen the movie The Wall? About the scariest movie I think I've ever seen. It's very intense. I also wanted to introduce readers to the innovative use of battle sleds during the breakout, in which the soldiers of the 3rd Division were literally dragged into battle. I wanted to explore how the brutal fight for Monte Cassino impacted the Anzio battle. Here's what the mountaintop abbey looked like after it was destroyed, and here's how it looks today in its fully restored state. How many of you have ever visited Monte Cassino and the abbey? A few, about 4 or 5 people. Great. You'll know what an amazing restoration job was accomplished at that place. I wanted also to give long overdue recognition to the brave nurses who performed their duties while under fire of the German guns and bombers, and sometimes lost their lives in the process. And the chaplains who gave unstintingly of themselves to provide spiritual comfort for the troops at the front, and the Italian citizens in Anzio and Nettuno and Aprilia and Cisterna, whose homes were destroyed and their lives forever changed by the battle, but who still thank the British and Americans for liberating them from the Germans. And the men of the graves registration units who had the unspeakably gruesome task of recovering bodies of the fallen. All their stories needed to be told. I also quote such famous combatants as Audie Murphy, who would go on to be the most decorated American soldier of World War II, and James Ornish, who was seriously wounded while fighting at Anzio. After recuperating, he gravitated to Hollywood, started acting, changed the spelling of his name, and became best known for his role as Marshal Matt Dillon in the TV series Gunsmoke. And I extensively quote from the great war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who covered the Anzio operation for many weeks. Surprisingly, there are very few written accounts by German soldiers, so I set out to find as many of those accounts as I could and include them in Desperate Valor. The Germans may have been the enemy, but they were also incredibly courageous. I also did my best to pay homage to the thousands of ordinary soldiers who, for the most part, never became famous, but who, by their courage, did their part to prevent a German victory at Anzio, often at the cost of their lives. I also include the biographies of the 26 Americans who earned the Medal of Honor at Anzio and the 2 British soldiers who were awarded the Victoria Cross, along with a telling of their heroic deeds. I detail the shameful efforts of Mark Clark to keep the British from sharing in the liberation of Rome, wanting that honor exclusively for his Americans. Today, the region has recovered fully from the war. Here's a look at Anzio's bustling harbor ringed with fine seafood restaurants. In fact, here's my wife dining in one of those outstanding restaurants. But maybe things at Anzio have recovered too well at the expense of history. The troops who engaged in this titanic struggle have been almost forgotten. I'm profoundly disappointed at Italy's lack of proper monuments and memorials to those who fought at Anzio. This small sign at the overpass is one of the few markers that tell the average visitor that something of great importance happened here. It's in 3 languages, Italian, German, and English, and it says, on this site, thousands of men fought and died. Well, that's, to me, not an adequate memorial to what had gone on there. This is what the battlefield looked like 74 years ago, and here's what it looks like today. The hallowed ground desecrated by factories, shopping centers, apartments, car dealerships, and more. If you care anything about history and battlefield preservation, this should make you angry. It's only when one visits the American and British cemeteries here that one gains an appreciation of the tremendous loss and sacrifice and the courage that took place here in early 1944. If one looks hard enough, one can discover an out-of-the-way plaque or two that memorializes the soldiers who lost their lives at Anzio. This building, for example, it's abandoned today, is where the British troops came ashore, and there's a plaque on the wall that gives a bit of its history. By the way, that white plastic chair in front of it is where the Italian prostitutes sit while waiting for customers to drive by. Although there are very few monuments or memorials to the savage fighting that went on for 124 days, I did manage to find a few remnants of the battle, such as the damaged statue of St. Michael in front of the church in Aprilia. You can see where the shrapnel has gone through the bronze. And this shrapnel damage behind St. Michael's church, and this shot up silo on a farm north of Aprilia, and this battle-scarred gatepost at Isola Bella, where the Rangers were wiped out. For the most part, though, traces of the battle have been erased or built over. In closing, then, my main reason for writing this book was to portray Anzio not as a failed offensive, which is the viewpoint of most historians, but as a triumphant defense on a par with the British stand at Rorke's Drift during the Zulu Wars in 1879, the Soviets' tenacious refusal to give up Stalingrad and Leningrad to the Germans, the Americans' dogged defense at Bastogne in Belgium, the desperate fighting that swirled around and on top of Porkchop Hill in Korea, and the Marines' stubborn defense at Khe Sanh during the Vietnam War. I believe that Anzio should be seen as another Alamo, but one with a better outcome. A defensive stand where the heroic defenders not only held off their attackers, but ultimately broke out and defeated their enemy. I'm hard-pressed to think of another battle with a similar outcome. You might be wondering, where did the title come from? I borrowed it from Winston Churchill. I asked if he would allow me to do that, and he said, okay, as long as I wrote good things about him. Because Anzio was basically his operation. He steamrolled it through. It came from his quote, "But fortune hitherto baffling rewarded the desperate valor of the British and American armies. The fighting was intense, the losses on both sides were heavy, but the deadly battle was won." I'm afraid that I've only just scratched the surface in this presentation of everything that's contained in Desperate Valor. I hope you'll buy a copy to get the complete story of courage beyond measure. Thank you very much for your attention today. Thank you. I may have not covered something, and a question has popped up in your mind, so we probably have a few minutes to field some questions, so fire away. Dave?
Go ahead and start. So the Rangers that were decimated,
Mm-hmm.
what happened? Was it did they blunder, or were they put up against forces that were much greater than they were? What happened?
The Germans intercepted a message that indicated the attack on Cisterna was coming, and so they had arrayed their forces over the likely avenue of approach. And so when it was, dark night, and the Rangers came through, and they were basically surrounded on three sides when the Germans opened up on them. So that's what happened to them. Yes, sir.
Did Patton have a role in this?
No. Patton was, you may recall, relieved of command of the 7th Army after the slapping incidents in Sicily, and was then sent back to England to prepare for his role in the invasion at Normandy. So he wasn't involved in any of the planning or operations that took place at Anzio or even Salerno prior to that. Yes, sir.
Who was Gustav and why the Gustav line?
It was, it's kind of like Americans have a phonetic alphabet. In World War II, it was Abel, Baker, Charlie, Dog. And I think it was just part of the German phonetic code, and they just assigned random names to particular terrain features or in this case, a defensive line. I don't think it had any biographical connection to any famous German in the past. Yes, Kathy.
I read somewhere that the Monte Cassino was seen as Americans as an outpost for German overlook. You may have covered this, I came in a little late. And then when they destroyed it, they found out that wasn't true. Is that?
Right. The Germans, prior to the destruction of Monte Cassino, which was carried out by U.S. Air Force to obliterate it because people thought that the Germans had observation posts in the Abbey, turned out not to be the case. That the Germans, prior to the Americans launching the attack on the Abbey and the Gustav Line in Monte Cassino, had removed much of the valuable artwork that was there and took it off somewhere for safekeeping. I think they took it to Rome. But after the monastery was turned into rubble, the Germans said, well, they're not respecting this holy site, so, let's use it. So then they brought in their observers and machine gun crews and mortar crews to utilize the rubble as a defensive fortification. But you're right about that. Dave?
If this had not been successful, would D-Day have occurred?
I think so. Part of the problem was that there was a very short window of opportunity. The Allies were moving equipment and troops out of Italy and bringing them to England to get ready for the invasion at Normandy. And so Clark and Alexander and Churchill knew they only had a very limited window in which to launch this operation. But what it did, it kept German troops occupied in Italy. They couldn't be sent to the Eastern Front or to Normandy. And so as long as the Allies were able to keep up pressure in Italy, that helped what was going on in Normandy and enabled the Americans and British to come across the channel.
That was part of the distraction, possibly.
Well, you could call it a diversionary operation, but I think they were two separate things. But people talk about the tyranny of Overlord. Overlord was the invasion of Normandy, and because it was sucking resources out of the Mediterranean to get ready for the invasion in northern France. And that was why Lucas only had 2 divisions initially to throw into the Anzio invasion, and why he felt he could not, have this salient that would streak out from Anzio up to Rome, because a salient, any military anybody who knows anything about the military, theory, whatever, starts with a T. They know that a salient is easily broken off, and even when the British were the first ones to make a move north of Aprilia, they found it was very easy for the Germans to attack them from all sides. So if Lucas had tried to send his whole command to Rome, they could have probably gotten there, but they would have been destroyed in the process, as long as the troops stuck on the Gustav Line couldn't come up and support them. So it was a real juggling act for everybody concerned. Mike?
Wasn't the push also to kind of relieve the pressure on Stalingrad by drawing off some?
It was thought that by maintaining an active combat theater in Italy, German troops could not be used to, reinforce the attack against the Soviets. So it had some benefits, in that regard as well. Tom?
What was the role of the Italian troops in this?
Well, that's a good question. The Italians. Okay, that was it. Thank you. The Italians, after Sicily was invaded from North Africa by the Americans and British, the Italians pretty much said, this is real fighting. I don't think we want to be involved in this. And when Sicily fell, the Germans and Italians evacuated across the Strait of Messina to the mainland of Italy. And about that point, the King of Italy says to Mussolini, who was the dictator and head of the fascist government, thanks, Benito, you've gotten us into a real pickle, and your services are no longer needed. And so the Italians, to keep from being attacked by their former ally, the Germans, signed a secret agreement with the Allies that said, we're not going to fight against you. We're going to declare ourselves neutral. And so, just don't break our country if you can help it. And so when the invasion of Salerno took place in September of '43, it was only the Germans fighting against the Allies. Now, there were a couple of Italian battalions who stayed loyal to Mussolini and to the Germans, and they fought a few little battles. There were a couple of battalions at Anzio, in fact, but we don't hear much about them. We don't know a whole lot. But it was primarily the Germans and the British and Americans who were fighting. Addie, did you have a question?
So I have two questions. One, what would Anzio look like today if we hadn't won the war?
Good question. What would Anzio look like today if we hadn't won the war? Boy, that's an imponderable.
What would Europe look like?
Yeah, the same would go for Europe. I mean, if you look at what happened behind the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe, it wasn't until late in the 1990s that there was any sort of major rebuilding of cities that had been decimated by the war. I mean, if you went to East Berlin, in 1980, you would still see shells of buildings that were bombed out. So if the Germans won, my guess is there'd be maybe some rebuilding just so the population could continue living. But I don't think they would have done the job that actually was done because the Allies did win the war. Yes, sir.
Was there a large naval landing force required at Anzio?
Well, at the beginning, they had to bring in 36,000 troops, British and American, into the beaches. And so I think they used every LST and every Higgins boat they could get their hands on to make the landings. And then they went back to Naples, picked up more troops for the second wave, and they were continually running ships up and down the coast from Naples to Anzio, bringing troops, bringing supplies, vehicles, ammunition, things of that sort. So, and then that was one of the problems because the Overlord operation had taken so much of the shipping resources out of the Mediterranean and taken it to England.
The reason I ask, an all-state running back didn't make it home to Anzio,
Who was that?
and Alan Mather, he was
Huh.
on the naval landing craft, as I understand.
Oh, really? Don't know that name, but there were thousands of people who were there. Anyone else? Dave?
Flint, I just, as a side, when I was in Naples, my wife and I, years ago, we did a tour, right? And he says, "Oh, you're American." I said, "Yes." He says, "Mark Clark is our hero." He says, "What you're gonna see today is here only because of Mark Clark." Because he refused to sell the city or to.
Well, I mean, he did some good things, but, you know, he had this tremendous ego. And if you go to the monastery at Monte Cassino, they have lots of negative things posted about Mark Clark because they think he was the one who ordered the bombing of the monastery, when in fact it was, I think, a South African general. When he was ordered to send his division up against the abbey, he said, "No, I'm not going to do it until you knock down the walls." And so I think Clark has gotten a bad rap in that sense, being blamed for the destruction there.
On the Abbey, I heard that because we bombed it, it really made it even worse to take because it created more places for the Germans to do.
Right, yeah.
The story
Lou?
about Clark is different if you happen to spend time in England.
Oh,
The British don't like you. They think the war lasted longer. They were not able to take a good portion of German forces because of his insistence on driving to Rome.
mm-hmm.
So they're quite negative on him.
Yeah, he has some negative press out there, but like I say, he did some good things and he did some things that weren't what you would call the pinnacle of military leadership. So he has to live, well, he's not alive now, but he had to live with that divided biography.
You say that about almost every general.
You could, yeah. Yeah, but not to their face, probably.
Any other questions?
Good job, Flint.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
And again, I know you have one of these before, but
Yes.
we always give our speaker one of our challenge coins.
I now have a matching set.
Yes, yes. We hope you'll stick around and talk with Flint some more. Just before I kind of release you, Harry had an announcement to make, and Harry's with our local American Legion group. Watch your cable there.
Oh, well,
And
Harry's coming up. I have a few books here. They're $30. That's $5 off the retail price. So if anybody would like those, I'll be happy to sign one for you.
Harry.
You guys don't know me, I'm Harry Fisher. I'm Post 58 Commander of the American Legion. We meet here at the museum second Thursday of every month. And what I'm doing here this morning, we've got a ceremony tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock over at the Commons. We're doing a 3-volley rifle salute to the veterans that are interred over there. So everybody here is invited to come over, and we promise we won't shoot you, so. We'll try not to. We got a couple of them that are shaky right now.
What time again?
11 o'clock in the morning. It's
Now, is that the Broomfield Commons or where?
right, Broomfield Commons.
Where we have the Memorial Day?
Yeah.
Cemetery.
Over at the cemetery.
Yeah.
And where's that on it? I don't.
It's up off of Sheridan.
By Sheridan.
Okay.
Up by the, what is it, Calvary Church, I think up there. It's the cemetery up on the hill there. We've got a veterans section up there. Like right now, there's like 123 veterans over there in that cemetery. And we're doing like I say, a 3-volley rifle salute for them in the morning, 11 o'clock. It's a nationwide thing that's coming out. They have the bells and rifles all across the nation. They're going to be doing that at 11 o'clock in the morning. So if you're not doing anything, more than welcome to come over and watch the fun. Dress warm. It's supposed to be snowing and 30 degrees. So.
And again, just as a reminder, this is the 100th year anniversary of the end of World War I, and that great tragedy.
Yes.
So,
We got that, and it's the 100th anniversary for the American Legion. Anybody interested in the Legion,
yeah.
come see me. Be more than happy to take care of any information you might need.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us again. Buy a book.
Thank you.